The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Murphy's Tavern, a dimly lit pub just 3 blocks from the University of Chicago campus. Inside, the warm amber glow of Edison bulbs cast dancing shadows across worn wooden tables, while the scent of aged whiskey and comfort food filled the air. The philosophy conference had ended hours ago, but the real conversations were just beginning. Ludwig Wittgenstein sat alone at a corner table, his fingers wrapped around a half-empty glass of beer, steam rising from his damp wool coat draped over the chair beside him. His piercing blue eyes studied the condensation patterns on his glass with the same intensity he once applied to logical propositions. The Austrian philosopher had always been drawn to quiet spaces where thoughts could crystallize without interruption. The tavern door swung open with a gust of cold Chicago wind, and Jacques Derrida stepped inside, shaking raindrops from his dark hair. The French philosopher's eyes swept the room, taking in every detail, the conversations flowing between tables, the bartender's mechanical movements, the way language seemed to hang in the air like cigarette smoke. His gaze settled on the solitary figure in the corner, and recognition flickered across his face. "Monsieur Wittgenstein," Derrida said, approaching with cautious respect. "May I join you? It seems we are both seeking refuge from the storm." Wittgenstein looked up, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please, though I must warn you, I am not in the mood for academic pleasantries." Derrida settled into the chair, ordering a glass of red wine from the passing waitress. The silence between them stretched like a taut wire, filled with the weight of decades of philosophical divergence. These were two minds that had shaped the landscape of 20th century thought, yet they had never truly engaged in direct dialogue. "You know," Derrida began, swirling his wine as it arrived, "I have always found it curious how we both concern ourselves with language, yet arrive at such different conclusions." Wittgenstein's laugh was dry, almost bitter. "Different? I would say opposite. You seem to believe language is nothing but smoke and mirrors, while I insist it can do real work in the world." "Ah, but that is where you misunderstand me," Derrida replied, leaning forward slightly. "I do not dismiss language. I simply refuse to pretend it offers us direct access to truth or reality. Every word carries within it the ghost of its own impossibility." The tavern seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the very air recognized the gravity of what was unfolding. Wittgenstein took a long sip of his beer, his eyes never leaving Derrida's face. "You speak of impossibility," Wittgenstein said slowly, "but look around us. Look at how language functions here, in this very moment. The waitress understood your order. I understand your words, even if I disagree with them. The bartender knows the difference between whiskey and wine. Language games are not impossibilities. They are the fabric of human life." Derrida smiled, but there was something melancholy in his expression. "And yet, my friend, what you call understanding is built upon an endless chain of deferrals. When you say beer, what do you really mean? The liquid, the concept, the cultural practice? Each meaning depends on what it is not, and that process never ends." "But it does end," Wittgenstein insisted, his voice gaining strength. "It ends in action, in form of life. When I order a beer, I get a beer. The language game achieves its purpose. Your philosophical anxiety about infinite deferral is precisely that. Anxiety, not reality." The intensity in the room was palpable now. Other patrons had begun to take notice of the animated conversation in the corner. Though few could have guessed, they were witnessing a collision between two of the most influential philosophical minds of the modern era. Derrida leaned back in his chair, studying Wittgenstein with the careful attention of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. "But what you call getting a beer is itself an interpretation, is it not? The liquid in your glass exists, certainly, but beer as a concept, as a meaning, as a cultural artifact, this is where language begins its work of construction rather than representation." "Construction, yes," Wittgenstein agreed, surprising Derrida, "but not arbitrary construction. Language is not a prison house, as your followers sometimes suggest. It is a tool, and tools have purposes. They can be used well or poorly, but they can certainly be used." The rain outside had intensified, creating a percussion against the windows that seemed to underscore the rhythm of their debate. Neither man had touched his drink in several minutes, their attention completely absorbed by the dance of ideas unfolding between them. "Tools," Derrida mused, rolling the word around like wine on his tongue. "Yes, I can accept that metaphor. But what if the tool changes the hand that holds it? What if language does not merely describe reality, but participates in its creation? What if every act of naming is also an act of violence?" Wittgenstein's eyes flashed with something between irritation and intrigue. "Violence? That is a strong word for something as simple as calling a spade a spade. But is it simple? Derrida pressed. To call something a spade is to exclude every other possible interpretation, to close off other ways of seeing, of being. Language does not capture reality, Ludwig. It shapes it, limits it, makes it possible while simultaneously making other realities impossible. The philosophical battle lines were now clearly drawn, and both men seemed to sense that they stood on the threshold of something significant. The casual atmosphere of the tavern had given way to something more charged, more consequential. Wittgenstein set down his glass with deliberate precision, the sound sharp against the wooden table. Then we have reached the heart of our disagreement, Jacques. You see language as a kind of cosmic joke, forever failing to reach its target. I see it as the most human thing we do, imperfect perhaps, but real, functional, alive. The chapter ends with both philosophers recognizing the depth of their philosophical chasm, setting the stage for a debate that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the relationship between words and world. The tavern had grown more crowded as the evening wore on, graduate students and faculty members filtering in from various conference events. The buzz of conversation created a backdrop of white noise that seemed to insulate Wittgenstein and Derrida's table from the outside world. Their debate had evolved from cautious probing to something more urgent, more personal. Derrida traced patterns on the condensation of his wineglass, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. You speak of language games, Ludwig, and I find the metaphor fascinating. But games have rules, do they not? And rules can be broken, bent, reimagined. What happens to your certainty when the rules themselves become unstable? Wittgenstein shifted in his chair, his engineer's mind already working through the implications. Rules in language games are not like mathematical axioms, Jacques. They emerge from use, from shared forms of life. When a rule changes, it is because our form of life has changed. The stability comes not from rigid adherence to abstract principles, but from our agreement in judgments. Agreement, Derrida repeated, savoring the word. But what is agreement except another kind of violence? To agree, we must suppress difference, must pretend that your understanding and mine point to the same thing. But they cannot, Ludwig. They can only appear to do so. A young philosophy student at a nearby table had begun to recognize the voices, whispering excitedly to her companions. The legend of both men preceded them. Wittgenstein with his tortured genius and revolutionary insights, Derrida with his playful yet devastating critiques of Western metaphysics. To witness them in direct conversation was like watching intellectual history unfold in real time. Wittgenstein noticed the attention, but seemed unbothered by it. His focus remained laser-sharp on Derrida's words. You mistake agreement for uniformity. When two builders agree that this is a slab and that is a block, they need not have identical mental experiences. They need only be able to coordinate their actions successfully. The meaning is in the coordination, not in some inner realm of private understanding. But coordination itself requires interpretation, Derrida countered, warming to his theme. The builder who hears slab must interpret that sound as referring to a particular object rather than as poetry or nonsense or prayer. That interpretation is never guaranteed, never stable. It depends on context, on what I call the iterability of the sign, its ability to be repeated in new contexts where its meaning might shift. The bartender, a philosophy graduate student himself, had begun listening more intently while polishing glasses. The conversation was reaching levels of complexity that made even seasoned academics lean in closer. Wittgenstein leaned forward, his voice growing more animated. You are correct that context matters enormously, but you draw the wrong conclusion from this fact. Yes, the word slab might mean different things in different contexts. Building material in one case, perhaps a piece of stone art in another. But within each context, within each language game, the meaning is clear, functional, precise. Clear to whom? Derrida asked, his voice gentle but insistent. Precise according to what standard? You assume a shared context, but context itself is never fully present to consciousness. It extends beyond any possible horizon, includes elements that neither speaker nor listener can fully grasp. Every context is surrounded by a non-context that haunts it. The philosophical sophistication of the exchange was drawing more attention now. Several tables had gone quiet, their occupants straining to follow the rapid-fire exchange of concepts and counter-arguments. Wittgenstein took a long drink of his beer, his eyes distant for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something approaching sadness. You know, Jacques, I spent years of my life trapped in exactly the kind of skeptical web you are weaving now. I tortured myself with questions about private sensations, about whether my red was the same as your red, about whether language could ever truly connect mind to world. And what freed you from that web? Derrida asked. genuinely curious. The recognition that the web itself was a philosophical illusion, Wittgenstein replied. The question of whether language really captures reality is not a question at all, it is a confusion. Language does not need to capture reality because it is part of reality. When we use language, we are not representing the world, we are acting in it. Derrida shook his head slowly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But that is precisely what I am arguing against, my friend. You want to dissolve the problem by making language fully present to itself, fully transparent in its operations. But what if the problem cannot be dissolved? What if the gap between sign and meaning, between language and reality, is not an illusion, but the very condition that makes meaning possible? The tension between them was mounting now, not the antagonistic tension of enemies, but the creative tension of two powerful minds pushing against each other's fundamental assumptions. Consider this, Derrida continued, gesturing toward the window where rain continued to streak the glass. You see that water falling and you call it rain. But rain is not the water itself. It is a concept that organizes our experience of the water. The concept comes to us through language, through history, through culture. We never experience pure water. We always experience water as rain, or water as storm, or water as blessing. Language does not describe reality. It makes reality possible as human experience. Wittgenstein was quiet for a long moment, his engineer's precision warring with something deeper and more uncertain. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, more contemplative. Perhaps we are not as far apart as we seem, Jacques. You are right that we never encounter raw, uninterpreted reality. But where you see this as evidence of language's failure to reach truth, I see it as evidence of language's success in creating truth. The rain you speak of is human rain, experienced through human concepts, embedded in human forms of life. And that is not a limitation. It is the only truth we could ever possibly have. The philosophical ground was shifting beneath both men, and they could feel it. The tavern had reached its evening peak, filled with the warm hum of voices and the clink of glasses. But at the corner table, time seemed suspended as two of the 20th century's most influential thinkers wrestled with questions that had haunted philosophy for millennia. The intensity of their debate had created an almost physical presence between them, drawing curious looks from nearby tables. Derrida swirled the remaining wine in his glass, watching the liquid catch the amber light. His voice, when he spoke, carried a weight that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of what they were discussing. Ludwig, I appreciate your desire to ground language in human practices, in what you call forms of life, but I must push you further. What if those very forms of life are themselves constituted by language? What if there is no solid ground beneath the web of signs and interpretations? Wittgenstein's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was the question that had driven him to the edge of madness in his youth, the abyss that his later philosophy had been designed to avoid. You are asking me to follow you into an infinite regress, Jacques. If language constitutes forms of life, and forms of life give meaning to language, then we are trapped in a circle with no way out. Exactly, Derrida said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. But what if that circle is not a trap? What if it is the very condition of human existence? We are always already within language, always already interpreting, always already deferred from any final meaning. This is not a problem to be solved. It is the structure of being itself. A crash of thunder outside seemed to punctuate Derrida's words, and several patrons jumped slightly. The storm had intensified, turning the world beyond the windows into a blur of wind and water. Inside the tavern, the warm light felt more precious, more fragile. Wittgenstein stood abruptly, beginning to pace the small space beside their table. His movements were sharp, controlled, but there was something desperate in them, like a caged animal testing the strength of its bonds. No, Jacques, you are making the same mistake that trapped me for years. You are treating language as if it were a metaphysical entity, something that exists independently of human beings and their activities. But language is not a thing, it is something we do. But doing is itself a form of interpretation, Derrida pressed, sensing that he had touched a nerve. When you do language, you must interpret the situation, interpret the other person's words, interpret your own intentions. There is no pure action, no immediate contact with reality that bypasses the work of interpretation. The young philosophy students at nearby tables had given up any pretense of their own conversations. They were witnessing something extraordinary, not just an intellectual debate, but a collision between two fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. Wittgenstein stopped pacing and turned to face Derrida directly, his blue eyes blazing with conviction. You want to make interpretation mysterious, cosmic, infinite, but interpretation is just another human practice. When a child learns to follow a rule, to continue a numerical series, to use a word correctly, what is mysterious about this? The child watches, imitates, gets corrected, tries again. Gradually, they master the technique. No infinite regress required. But what is mastery? Derrida asked quietly. The child who learns to count to 10, have they mastered numbers, or have they simply learned to repeat a performance without understanding its foundation? What happens when they encounter 11, 12, 13? They must make a creative leap, must interpret the rule in a new context. And that interpretation could always go wrong. Wittgenstein sat back down, his energy suddenly seeming to drain away. Yes, it could go wrong, but it usually goes right. And when it goes wrong, we have ways of correcting it, teaching it, improving it. You are obsessed with the possibility of failure while ignoring the overwhelming reality of success. The tavern seemed to hold its breath as Derrida considered his response. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more personal than it had been all evening. I am not obsessed with failure, Ludwig. I am trying to honor the creativity that makes success possible. If meaning were already determined, already stable, already present to itself, then human beings would be nothing more than biological computers executing predetermined programs. But meaning is not predetermined, Wittgenstein replied, his voice matching Derrida's quieter tone. It emerges from our activities, our interactions, our shared responses to the world. It is creative without being arbitrary, stable without being static. And yet, Derrida said, that emergence you speak of, is it not precisely what I call difference? The process by which meaning comes to be through difference, through deferral, through the play of presence and absence. Your language games are not self-contained universes, Ludwig. They refer to other games, depend on other games, bleed into other games. The boundaries are never as clean as you want them to be. A group of undergraduate students had quietly moved to a table closer to the philosophers, clearly hoping to catch more of the conversation. The bartender had stopped all pretense of working and was listening openly now. Wittgenstein looked out at the storm-darkened window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. Perhaps, he said slowly, perhaps we are describing the same phenomenon from different angles. You see the play of difference where I see the stability of rule following. You see infinite deferral where I see pragmatic success. Or perhaps, Derrida suggested gently, we are both right and both wrong. Perhaps language neither captures reality nor completely fails to capture it. Perhaps it does something else entirely, something that cannot be understood in terms of success or failure, presence or absence, truth or error. The philosophical tension in the room had reached a breaking point, but it was not the breaking point of conflict. It was the breaking point of understanding, where two minds pushed so hard against each other that something new threatened to emerge. Wittgenstein turned back to Derrida, and for the first time all evening, his expression was not argumentative but genuinely curious. What do you think language does then, if not capture or fail to capture reality? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge and an invitation combined. The storm outside had begun to subside, leaving only the gentle patter of rain against the windows and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Inside Murphy's tavern, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. The crowd of onlookers remained transfixed, but the combative energy between Wittgenstein and Derrida had transformed into something more collaborative, more exploratory. Derrida cradled his wineglass, considering Wittgenstein's question with the seriousness it deserved. The overhead lights seemed dimmer now, casting longer shadows across their table, creating an intimacy that made their conversation feel almost confessional. What does language do? Derrida repeated slowly. Perhaps it makes possible the very question you have just asked. Not by representing reality or failing to represent it, but by opening a space where questioning can occur, where human beings can relate to themselves and to each other in ways that exceed any particular answer. Wittgenstein nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. "Oh, you know, Jacques, I have always been suspicious of philosophical questions that seem to have no clear method for answering them, but you are suggesting that the questioning itself might be more important than any possible answer." "Not more important," Derrida clarified, "but more fundamental. Answers close down possibilities, create temporary resting places in the movement of thought. But questions, good questions, open up new possibilities, new ways of seeing, new forms of life, as you might say." The young graduate student who had first recognized their voices approached tentatively, clearly torn between respect for their privacy and burning intellectual curiosity. Wittgenstein noticed her hesitation and gestured for her to come closer. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not want to interrupt, but I am writing my dissertation on the relationship between language and meaning, and I could not help but overhear. Are you suggesting that the traditional philosophical problem of representation might be a false problem?" Wittgenstein and Derrida exchanged a look that held years of mutual respect despite their disagreements. It was Derrida who answered first. "Not false, exactly, but perhaps based on assumptions that we should question. The idea that language should represent reality assumes a separation between language and reality that may not hold up under scrutiny." "Indeed," Wittgenstein added, warming to the young woman's question. "We use language to coordinate our activities, to express our thoughts and feelings, to create art and music and poetry, to ask questions and seek answers. Why should we expect it to do the additional work of representing a reality that exists completely independently of human concerns?" The graduate student's eyes lit up with understanding. "So language does not fail to represent reality. It does not even attempt to represent reality in that sense." "It attempts many things," Derrida said with a slight smile. "It creates communities, establishes differences, opens possibilities, closes possibilities, expresses creativity, enforces power relations, enables love, enables hatred. Representation may be one of its functions, but it is certainly not its only function, or even its primary function." Other listeners had begun to gather around their table now, drawn by the unexpected accessibility of the conversation. The two philosophical giants seemed energized by the engagement with younger minds. Wittgenstein leaned back in his chair, looking more relaxed than he had all evening. "You know, I spent the first part of my philosophical career trying to construct a perfect logical language that would mirror the structure of reality exactly. The attempt nearly destroyed me. It was only when I gave up that impossible dream that I began to see language as it actually is. Messy, creative, human, alive. And I," Derrida added, "have spent my career trying to show that the dream of perfect representation is not just impossible but actively harmful, that it prevents us from appreciating the richness and complexity of human meaning-making. But perhaps we have both been too focused on what language cannot do rather than celebrating what it can do." A young philosophy professor who had been listening from a nearby table finally spoke up. "But if language does not represent reality, how do we account for truth? How do we distinguish between valid and invalid claims about the world?" The question created a moment of silence, as if everyone present recognized its importance. Wittgenstein and Derrida looked at each other, and something passed between them. Not agreement exactly, but a shared recognition of the question's complexity. "Truth," Wittgenstein said finally, "emerges from our practices of inquiry, our methods of investigation, our agreements in judgment. It is not a relationship between language and some language-independent reality. It is a human achievement, hard-won through experiment, argument, correction, and refinement." "And yet," Derrida added gently, "those very practices of inquiry are themselves enabled by language, shaped by language, limited by language. We cannot step outside of language to check whether our truths correspond to reality, but this does not make truth arbitrary. It makes truth contextual, historical, revisable." The bartender, who had been following the conversation with increasing fascination, finally spoke up. "So are you saying that truth is whatever we agree it is?" Both philosophers shook their heads simultaneously, and several people in the crowd chuckled at the synchronization. "Not arbitrary agreement," Wittgenstein clarified, "reasoned agreement, based on careful observation, rigorous argument, openness to correction. The methods matter enormously. And not final agreement either," Derrida added. "Agreement that remains open to challenge, to reinterpretation, to transformation. Truth as an ongoing conversation, rather than a final destination." The rain had stopped completely now, and through the windows, the first stars were becoming visible between the breaking clouds. The evening had taken on an almost magical quality, as if the storm had washed the world clean and left space for new possibilities. Wittgenstein raised his glass in a gesture that seemed half toast, half acknowledgement. "Jacques, I think we may have discovered something tonight that neither of our individual philosophies could have reached alone." Derrida raised his own glass in response. "To the questions that have no final answers, but that make us more human in the asking." "To language," Wittgenstein added, "in all its messy, creative, impossible, necessary glory." The gathering of students and faculty raised their glasses as well, participating in a moment that felt both intimate and historic. As the evening wound down and people began to drift back to their own conversations, both philosophers remained seated, no longer debating but simply thinking together about the mystery of human meaning-making. Outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving the night air clean and full of possibility. Inside Murphy's Tavern, two of the greatest minds of the 20th century had discovered that their apparent opposition might be two sides of the same profound insight. That language is neither a perfect mirror of reality nor a complete distortion of it, but something far more interesting. The very medium through which human beings create meaning, community, and understanding in a world that offers no guarantees. The conversation would continue in different forms in different venues with different participants. But the insight they had reached together, that questioning itself might be more fundamental than answering, that language creates rather than merely represents, that truth is a human achievement rather than a divine gift, would ripple outward into countless other conversations, other questions, other possibilities for human understanding. In the end, perhaps, that is what philosophy is for, not to provide final answers, but to create spaces where better questions can emerge, where human beings can think together about what it means to be human in a world mediated by language, symbol, and interpretation. The debate between Wittgenstein and Derrida had become something else entirely, a collaboration in the deepest sense, a shared exploration of the mystery that connects word to world to human experience. As they finally prepared to leave, both men seemed to carry with them not the satisfaction of victory, but the deeper satisfaction of having thought well together about questions that matter. The tavern would return to its normal rhythm, but something had changed in that corner, where two minds had met and discovered unexpected common ground in their very differences.